Well, I think that we should balance the budget tomorrow. They're talking about $38 billion for the fiscal year that we're in, cutting. They're talking about $100 billion next year. The highest proposal being made is a $500 billion reduction. Well, that's a third of what it should be. It should be that we balance revenues with expenditures. And if we don't do that, I think we're going to find ourselves I think we're on the verge of a financial collapse, and unless we do this, we may find ourselves in exactly that, a financial collapse.
So you're skiing today, looking at the beautiful cliffs around the Taos countryside, and you're saying that our economy and economies around the world are in danger of going off the cliff.
Well, what's going to happen is that Spain earlier this week was downgraded by Moody's. Well, okay, so that's a downgrade. Well, let's say Spain comes to market with its debt next week, and there's no appetite for that debt. Well, yield's going to go up a couple of percentage points, and hey, what if there's still no appetite for that debt? Well, now all of a sudden, government debt worldwide is put under the microscope, and you know what? It just doesn't hold up. Our $100 trillion in unfunded entitlement liability doesn't show any way that it could ever be paid back. Or accounted for in the first place.
Some of what would be some symptoms of the world actually having gone over the cliff?
Well, the symptoms will be. It won't be a symptom. It'll just plain happen, and that will be a collapse in the government debt worldwide.
And government debt is held
by treasuries,
right? Are held by U.S. citizens and other folks around the world. They're not responsible for this this catastrophe. Aren't bankers responsible?
Well, you could government's responsible, borrowing more money than what we're able to spend. So when you talk about who's responsible, who holds the debt? Well, right now, the Federal Reserve holds a tremendous amount of this debt. They're printing money and buying up our own government obligations. This is a recipe for disaster.
But one of the symptoms is already perhaps showing its hand, and that's the devaluing of the dollar.
Well, that's happening every single day, that the dollar is, in fact, being devalued. So, yes, commodity prices going through the roof. How is that happening? Well, we've got a devalued dollar. In essence, with so many more dollars in circulation, those dollars they're still going to buy X commodities.
Still, the U.S. government helped prop up a bank's balance sheets after the subprime mortgage fallout.
Exactly, and that's another shoe that potentially drops in all of this. Is that there's a lot of debt on the books that isn't being reflected at true value, and as we move along, banks are supposed to be making those adjustments. Well, they're really not.
So what are your recommendations?
Balance the federal budget tomorrow.
And how do you do that?
Well, you start off with Medicaid, Medicare. I think that you block grant the states, the federal government block grants the states Medicaid and Medicare by cutting 43% out of those budgets right off the bat, and that the states then end up delivering health care to the poor and those over 65. 50 laboratories of innovation that will actually make that happen. Social Security is relatively a small problem compared to Medicare. Medicare is going to engulf the entire federal budget here in a fairly short amount of time if it's not brought under control.
But are states responsible enough to deal with block grants?
Absolutely. States always have to balance their budgets. The issue when it comes to states is that states year to year will oftentimes, if not more than oftentimes, underestimate expenditures and overestimate revenues, and that's the way states get through it. But they do have to be ultimately accountable over a several-year period.
The U.S. isn't the only country in this position. I think that I've heard you say that China is sitting on a bubble because of their own investment in infrastructure.
Well, it's my understanding that 70% of China's GDP is infrastructure that the government's paying for. So there's a huge real estate bubble being created right now that has been created in China. And I think as a result of that, you're going to see a devaluation of the yuan.
So we've heard you talk about strategic budget cuts, overwhelming budget cuts to get this in order. But, with the economy maybe even facing stagflation, large numbers of people unemployed, is right now the time to be cutting things like Pell Grants, where people are going back to school to retrain themselves? Is it time to be cutting spending from developing alternative energy resources and research, and developing research for medical care?
Well, as a result of this spending, as a result of all those examples that you pointed out, we're going to be left with nothing, because there will be a financial collapse as a result of that. And I would just suggest that we'd be a lot better off by cutting and taking the medicine that would go along with doing that, as opposed to dying as a patient.
There's not really that much difference, as you pointed out, between what the Republicans are proposing and what the Democrats are proposing. If you were president, and some people have suggested that you're considering running, I guess it's a hypothetical possibility at this point, as the executive, how would you get those two groups to look at this realistically?
Well, that they do need to look at it realistically, that a budget needs to be submitted that in fact does reflect this $1.5 trillion in reduction, and then fight it out. And by fight it out, it's definitely a fight worth taking on. The result being you and I having a country to live in, as opposed to losing it all, which is where we're at.
Seems like every campaign, anyone that talks about Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid, is at real peril with the voters. But you've said in the past that, if we don't get spending under control, that these unfunded entitlements like Social Security, you'll be getting the check, but you won't be able to spend it on anything. Is that because stagflation is raising its head?
Well, that's because inflation would in fact raise its head, that the federal government would simply monetize the debt by continuing to print money, and by continuing to print money, will we get our... How's this going to manifest itself? Well, we're still going to get our Social Security checks. It's just that they're not going to buy anything. Germany in the 1920s, 120,000 Weinmarks, and I apologize if I'm not pronouncing that right, but 120,000 Weinmarks bought a home in Berlin. A year later, 120,000 Weinmarks bought a loaf of bread. That's what happened. That's what will happen.
So, with your understanding and having been an executive, the governor of New Mexico, it doesn't look like they're going to take it that seriously this year. And that could really catapult us into this economic catastrophe. Where's Gary Johnson investing his money, and what are you doing with your cash?
Well, there's no... The issue right now is that regardless of where you put your cash, it's in peril. If you're going to put your money in savings accounts of any kind, there's no yield whatsoever. So having them in savings accounts, at least you have liquidity. Putting it in the stock market, well, that's what's happening right now. We're creating another bubble in the stock market. And we're also creating bubbles when it comes to real estate, in that we're still continuing to prop up real estate unrealistically. So I wouldn't pretend to tell anyone or have any advice for anyone as to where to put their money right now. Obviously, people are putting their money in commodities because commodities theoretically should keep up with inflation. And that's the reason for the huge, gigantic run-up in commodities. But given the huge run-up, I mean, how much further do they run up before we actually come head-to-head with this collapse?
And so just give us a hint on when you're going to be making a decision. Right now, you're the chairman of the Our America Initiative. Will you be a candidate for president of the United States in 2012?
Well, speaking hypothetically, if one were to consider doing that, I would think that person would have to be on the verge of announcing, because last cycle at this time there were 14 announced candidates for president, and at this point there are just a handful, I think.
How many trips have you made to New Hampshire and Iowa combined over the last 18 months, 2 years?
Probably about 14 combined between those two states. Yeah.
So would you suggest you might have a good support group in each of those early primary states and caucus states?
Well, I've been to 32 states, and what I've been saying, I was kind of looking to get egged and tomatoed and sent back here to spend my time, but I'm finding I'm not having as much time to spend here as I might like.
And you, of course, have a lot of people following you on some of the social media networks. Tell us where they can find you on the web and on the Twitter and
Well,
Facebook.
go to ouramericainitiative.com, and really that'll give you the pointers to go just about anywhere.